This beggar girl accuses Millionaire's wife of poisoning him, but moments later, the truth is revealed. Rate my story from 0 to 10 in the comments. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The scream sliced through the muggy afternoon air like a razor, echoing through the narrow streets of the historic town at precisely 3 o'clock. The 52-year-old businessman nearly dropped his coffee cup as he stepped away from the window of his luxury apartment. It was always at the same time, always with the same desperate intensity. For 3 weeks straight, that sound had been coming from the old Victorian house across the street, a faded yellow two-story building with peeling blue window frames that contrasted sharply with the elegance of his modern condo building. Must just be some kid throwing a tantrum, he thought, straightening his tie before returning to his work. As the owner of one of the largest construction companies in the region, he was used to solving complex problems involving millions in contracts and investments. His wealth included holdings in the stock market and even some cryptocurrencies that his accountant insisted he invest in. But he preferred to stay out of other people's dramas, especially after 5 years of living alone since losing his wife on a rainy night he preferred not to remember. Across the street, inside the Victorian house, the 4-year-old girl cowered in the corner of the kitchen, her thin arms not enough to protect her from what was coming next. The 38-year-old woman held a metal spoon firmly, having heated it on the electric stove, her eyes red from the alcohol she had been drinking since noon at the corner bar, fixed on the child, trembling before her. "You're a plague on this house," the aunt hissed, her voice slurred by the booze. "Because of you, my sister is gone. Because of you, I lost everything." The spoon came down hard on the small arm, leaving a red mark that would join the other scars that dotted the thin skin. The girl bit her lip to keep from screaming louder. She had learned that screams only enraged her aunt, who had worked at City Hall, until she was fired for constant absences caused by her addiction. She closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's soft voice, singing that lullaby before bed. It was all that was left of her now, fragments of memories and a melody that insisted on echoing in her mind during the most painful moments. "Stop sniveling," the aunt grunted, putting the spoon back in the drawer as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Go to your room, and I don't want to see you until tomorrow. And if you smear those dirty charcoals on the walls again, you'll see what real punishment is." The girl ran to the small room at the back of the house, a stuffy space with an old bed and a crucifix on the wall. There, she curled up in the thin sheet and began to hum her mother's lullaby softly, the only thing that still comforted her. She didn't know that across the street, someone had finally paid attention to that melody. The businessman stopped reviewing the contracts when he heard the faint but distinct sound. He knew that song. His late wife used to sing it when she cooked, a folk song about free birds. But where was it coming from? He approached the window again, his eyes scanning the facade of the Victorian house. One of the back windows was ajar, and from there came that childish voice, shaky but persistent. For the first time in 3 weeks, he felt something other than simple annoyance. There was something in that voice that touched a sensitive chord in his chest, something that reminded him of responsibilities long buried under layers of work and isolation. Next door to the Victorian house, the 61-year-old retired teacher was watering her begonias when she heard the girls singing. Unlike the wealthy neighbor, she could no longer ignore the signs. During her 40 years teaching elementary school, she had developed a sixth sense for children in distress. And that voice carried a pain that made her heart clench. How strange, she thought, watching the windows of the neighboring house, a family she had known for decades. The aunt had always been troubled, but since she had taken custody of her orphaned niece, something had changed in the atmosphere of that house. The girl never played in the yard, never ran through the streets like the other children in the historic town. The teacher wiped her hands on her apron and made a decision. The next morning, she would pay a courtesy visit to her neighbor. It had been a long time since she had talked to her properly, and maybe it was time to get to know the little girl better. Meanwhile, the businessman remained at the window, an uncomfortable feeling growing in his chest. The music had stopped, but something in those few minutes had awakened memories that he preferred to keep dormant. Memories of a former employee who had resigned abruptly 5 years ago, a few months before the loss of his wife. That woman was kind, always humming while organizing the construction company's files. Then, suddenly, she had simply disappeared from his life, leaving only a formal resignation letter and many unanswered questions. He had never thought about her again until he heard that familiar song echoing from a house where a child seemed to be suffering in silence. The sun began to set over the mountains that surrounded the town when the girl finally fell asleep, exhausted by pain and fear. Her small fingers clutched the sheet, and in her dreams she flew like the birds she secretly drew on the kitchen walls with pieces of charcoal found in the yard. Across the street, the businessman closed the curtains and tried to return to work, but he couldn't concentrate. Something had changed that afternoon, something he didn't yet fully understand. For the first time in years, he felt that maybe it was time to pay attention to what was happening beyond his own windows. Night fell on the historic town, but the echo of that children's song continued to resonate in the mind of a man who had spent 5 years running away from his responsibilities, and a retired teacher who had never been able to ignore a child's suffering. The next morning brought with it the aroma of fresh bread from the local bakeries and the typical bustle of the town, waking up for another day. The retired teacher put on her best floral dress and combed her grey hair with extra care. There was something in that child's voice that wouldn't leave her alone, an echo of hopelessness that she recognized from her years as an educator. At 9 o'clock sharp, she knocked on the door of the Victorian house. The sound echoed through the silent interior until shuffling footsteps approached. The aunt opened the door with a swollen face and red eyes, clearly suffering the effects of the previous night's binge. "Good morning," the teacher said with her gentlest smile. "I came to pay a courtesy visit. It's been so long since we've had a proper conversation." The aunt hesitated, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "Oh, teacher, It's not a good time. The house is a mess." "Nonsense, dear. We've been neighbors for so long." The teacher took a step forward, forcing the woman to back away. "And I would very much like to meet your niece. I hear she's a lovely girl." The aunt's face hardened for a moment before forcing a weak smile. "The girl is sick, high fever. Better not get close." At that moment, a soft noise came from the kitchen, the sound of something being dragged on the floor. The teacher pricked up her ears, immediately recognizing the sound of a child trying to move silently. "Maybe I can help," the educator insisted. "I have experience with sick children. I raised 3 children, you know how it is." "No need, no," the aunt replied quickly, blocking the entrance with her body. "I already took her to the doctor. It's just the flu. It'll pass soon." The teacher noticed the woman's nervous hands, the way she avoided eye contact, and especially the strong smell of alcohol that emanated from her, even though it was so early. All the signs she had learned to recognize during decades dealing with troubled families. Across the street, the businessman watched the scene from his window while having breakfast. He had woken up earlier than usual, disturbed by confusing dreams where a child's voice mixed with memories of his former employee. When he saw the teacher at the door of the Victorian house, a strange curiosity swept over him. The educator finally said goodbye, but not before casting an inquisitive look into the interior of the house. There was something deeply wrong there, and her experience told her that a child was suffering. As she walked back to her house, she decided that she needed to find a way to verify her suspicions. Inside the Victorian house, the aunt locked the door tightly and headed to the kitchen, where she found the girl crouching behind the table, trying to hide. The child had tried to reach a glass of water from the sink, but her height didn't allow it, and she had knocked over a chair in the process. "Didn't I tell you to stay in your room?" the aunt growled, her irritation intensified by the hangover and the unexpected visit. "I was thirsty," the girl murmured, her large eyes fixed on the floor. "Thirsty?" the aunt laughed bitterly. "You want water? Then go get it in the yard. And since you like making so much noise, you can stay out there until I decide you can come in." The girl went out to the small backyard, a space surrounded by high walls and dominated by a single apple tree. There, she sat on the ground and began to draw with a piece of charcoal she had found near the stove. They were always birds, small, large, some flying, others perched on imaginary branches. Each stroke represented her dream of freedom, of flying away from that house where pain was her only constant companion. The hours passed slowly. The aunt had locked the back door, leaving the girl in the yard under the hot midday sun. The child began to feel dizzy, but she knew that knocking on the door would only result in more punishment. So she began to hum her mother's lullaby softly, the melody being her only source of comfort. It was this melody that reached the businessman's ears again. This time, he couldn't ignore it. There was something too familiar in that voice, in that specific song. He picked up his cell phone and, almost without thinking, began to record. He didn't know exactly why, but an instinct told him that he might need that evidence. As he recorded, fragments of memories began to fit together in his mind. His former employee hummed that same song while working. She had been an exemplary worker until she disappeared abruptly. She always spoke fondly about her little daughter, a girl named... The cell phone trembled in his hands when the realization hit him like a punch in the stomach. His former employee's daughter had that name. The child suffering in the house across the street was the daughter of the kind woman who had worked for him for 3 years before simply disappearing. How hadn't he made that connection before? The businessman put away his cell phone and began to pace back and forth in his apartment. He vaguely remembered his ex-employee mentioning family problems, a sister she didn't get along with, financial difficulties. But he was so absorbed in his own problems at the time, the growing conflicts with his wife, the problems in the company that threatened his capital, accumulated over years of work, that he had not paid due attention. Now, 5 years later, that woman's daughter was across the street, and from the sounds coming from that house, she wasn't in a good situation. The guilt he carried for the loss of his wife multiplied, now including the regret for not having helped when she clearly needed it. At 3 o'clock punctually, the screams started again. This time, the businessman didn't move away from the window. He watched with growing horror as through the kitchen window of the Victorian house, he saw a female silhouette moving aggressively. He picked up his cell phone again and began to record, this time with more determination. What he saw through the cell phone screen made him nauseous. The aunt was holding something in her hands. It seemed to be a kitchen utensil, and she gestured violently in the direction of a small figure that he could barely distinguish. The girl's screams echoed through the afternoon, and this time the businessman couldn't pretend they were just childish tantrums. When the silence returned, he remained at the window for a few more minutes, his heart pounding in his chest. He had just witnessed something that would change everything. The question now was, what would he do with this information? That night, the girl slept on the floor of the yard, where the aunt had left her as punishment for making noise during the afternoon. The child curled up in her own t-shirt and looked at the stars through the branches of the apple tree. In her 4-year-old mind, she made a silent wish to her mother, wherever she was, that someone, anyone, would take her out of that place of pain. Across the street, the businessman couldn't sleep, tormented by the certainty that he needed to act, but paralyzed by the same emotional inertia that had consumed him since his wife's departure. His wealth was worth millions, his name was respected in business circles, but none of that mattered if he couldn't find the courage to help an innocent child who was suffering just a few feet away. 3 days had passed since the businessman discovered the child's identity, and guilt consumed him like a slow fire. During those days, he had systematically documented the episodes of violence, always at 3 o'clock, always with the same methodical brutality. His collection of videos and audios grew, but his courage to act remained paralyzed by the same cowardice that had haunted him since the night he lost his wife. On that Thursday morning, the retired teacher made a decision that would change the course of everything. She had spent the night awake, tormented by the certainty that a child was suffering just a few feet from her house. Her 4 decades as an educator had taught her to recognize the signs, and all of them were present in the neighboring Victorian house. She decided to approach the situation differently. Instead of trying a new direct visit to the aunt, she opted for a more subtle strategy. At 7 in the morning, she positioned herself in the side yard of her house, the place from where she had the best view of the backyard of the Victorian house. What she saw horrified her. The girl was sitting under the apple tree, completely alone, wearing only a torn t-shirt and panties. Her small arms were marked by obvious burns, some still red and inflamed. The child was drawing in the dirt with a piece of charcoal, creating shapes that the teacher recognized as birds. "Oh my God," the educator whispered, her hands trembling as she held onto the fence that separated the yards. It was worse than she imagined. Much worse. The girl looked up and saw the lady watching her. For a moment the two stared at each other in silence. Then, to the teacher's surprise, the child smiled, a weak but genuine smile, and waved shyly. "Hi, Grandma," the girl said in her tiny voice, using the affectionate term she gave to all elderly ladies. "Hi, honey," the teacher replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Are you okay?" The girl glanced quickly at the windows of the house before answering. "I'm fine. I'm just drawing birdies." "That's nice. Do you like birds?" "I like them a lot. They can fly wherever they want," the child replied, her big eyes shining with a sadness that broke the teacher's heart. At that moment, the aunt's harsh voice echoed from inside the house. "Where are you, girl?" The terror that instantly took over the child's face said everything the teacher needed to know. The girl got up quickly, wiped her hands on her t-shirt, and ran into the house, but not before looking once more at the educator with an expression that screamed for help. The teacher remained in the yard for a few more minutes, processing what she had seen. The burns, the fear, the way the child reacted to the aunt's voice, everything confirmed her worst fears. She could no longer pretend she didn't know what was happening. Meanwhile, across the street, the businessman had witnessed the entire interaction. Through his window, he could partially see the backyard, and the sight of the marks on the girl's arms made him sick. For the first time in 5 years, he felt genuine rage burning in his chest. His former employee had trusted him in some way, even if indirectly. Even if he didn't know it at the time, she had left her daughter in the care of a family that lived in the same town where he lived. And now that child was being tortured while he watched from his comfortable window, paralyzed by his own cowardice. At 11 in the morning, the teacher made a courageous decision. She put on her best dress, took a tray of homemade cookies that she had prepared as a pretext, and headed again to the Victorian house. This time, she wouldn't take no for an answer. The aunt answered the door reluctantly, clearly annoyed by the neighbor's insistence. "Teacher, I already told you it's not a good time." "Honey, I brought some cookies I made yesterday," the educator interrupted firmly, "and I insist on getting to know the little girl better. As long-time neighbors, it is our duty to support each other." Before the aunt could protest, the teacher had already entered the house, using all the authority that decades of classroom experience had given her. The interior of the Victorian house was dark and smelled of mold mixed with alcohol. Old and poorly maintained furniture occupied the room, and there was a heavy atmosphere that made the air seem difficult to breathe. "The girl is sleeping," the aunt lied, blocking the way to the back of the house. "What a pity. Maybe another time then," the teacher said. but her experienced eyes had already catalogued several disturbing details. Dark stains on the kitchen floor that appeared to have been poorly cleaned, a metal spoon left on the stove, and especially small charcoal drawings on the walls that had clearly been made by a child. At that moment, a low sound came from the direction of the kitchen, a muffled sob, almost imperceptible. The teacher and the aunt froze. The silence that followed was tense and revealing. "It must be the neighbor's cat," the aunt said quickly, but her voice trembled slightly. The teacher smiled and nodded, but had decided she had seen enough. "Well, I'll let you rest then. But remember that I'm always next door if you need anything. Anything at all." The educator's tone made it clear that it wasn't just a casual offer of help, it was a subtle but direct warning. After the teacher left, the aunt locked the door tightly and headed to the kitchen, where she found the girl curled up behind the stove trying to hide. The child had cried when she heard the teacher's gentle voice, remembering the kindness she had once known. "You were making noise," the aunt accused, her eyes already shining with familiar fury. "No, Auntie, I didn't make noise," the girl protested, but her small voice sounded weak even to her. The aunt took the metal spoon that was on the stove and put it directly into the flame. The girl recognized the ritual and began to tremble. She knew what was coming next. "You want to get attention, don't you?" the aunt hissed as the spoon heated up. "You want the neighbors to come here and ask questions? Do you think I don't know how to take care of you?" Across the street, the businessman had positioned his cell phone on the window and was recording again. This time, he managed to capture not only the sounds, but also partial images through the kitchen window. What he saw made him make a decision that would change everything. He could no longer be just a silent observer. His former employee had been a good person, a dedicated worker who always spoke of her daughter with love. That child was his responsibility now, whether he wanted it or not. While the girl suffered another episode of systematic torture, the businessman made a call that he hadn't made in months. He called his personal lawyer and old college friend. "I need your help with a delicate situation," he said, watching through the window as the girl's screams echoed through the afternoon. "It's about a child, and I think it could be a matter of life." That night, after the aunt fell asleep drunk on the living room sofa, the girl managed to quietly slip out into the yard. Her new burns stung, but the physical pain was less than the pain in her heart. She sat under the apple tree and looked at the stars, humming her mother's lullaby softly. What she didn't know was that, for the first time in months, someone was truly paying attention to her suffering. And that, in the coming days, her life would change in ways she couldn't even imagine. The lawyer arrived at the businessman's apartment on Friday morning with a grave expression on his face. The two men had been classmates at university almost 3 decades ago, and the lawyer knew well the emotional isolation that his friend had built after the loss of his wife. Therefore, the urgent phone call the night before had surprised him so much. "I need you to tell me exactly what's going on," the lawyer said, sitting down in the apartment's spacious living room. "You spoke about a child in danger, but I need details." The businessman poured coffee and stood near the window, the place that had become his obsession in recent days. "The girl who lives in the house across the street is the daughter of a former employee of mine. She is being abused by the aunt who takes care of her." "Abused how?" the lawyer asked, taking a notepad from his briefcase. "Burns, daily screams, neglect." The businessman paused, struggling with the words. "I have recordings, evidence of what's happening." The lawyer was silent for a moment, processing the information. "This is very serious. If you have evidence of child abuse, you need to contact the authorities immediately." "I know," the businessman replied, running his hands over his face. "But there's something else. The girl's mother worked for me for 3 years. She left abruptly in 2019, a few months before the accident. I never understood why. But now you feel responsible," the lawyer completed, understanding the emotional complexity of the situation. The businessman nodded. If I had paid more attention at the time, maybe I could have helped. Maybe she wouldn't have had to leave her daughter with this woman. At that moment, the familiar sound of screams echoed from the house across the street, even though it was only 9 in the morning. Both men turned to the window, and the lawyer could see the expression of anguish on his friend's face. "This happens every day?" he asked, horrified. "At 3 in the afternoon, religiously." "But sometimes also at other times," the businessman replied, picking up his cell phone. "Do you want to see the recordings?" The lawyer watched the videos in growing silence, his face paling with each scene. As a specialist in family law, he had seen many cases of child abuse, but something in the systematization of that violence disturbed him deeply. "We can't wait any longer. I need you to give me all these recordings today. I'm going to contact Child Protective Services and the District Attorney's Office. This child needs to be removed from that house immediately." While the two men planned the intervention, across the street, the girl was living another day of terror. The aunt had woken up with a particularly severe hangover and discovered that there was no more alcohol in the house. Her irritation multiplied when she found new drawings of birds that the girl had made on the kitchen wall during the early morning hours. "How many times do I have to tell you not to dirty the walls?" the aunt screamed, grabbing the girl by the arm hard enough to leave marks. "You are a plague, a curse on this house." The girl tried to explain, to say that she had dreamed of her mother, and that the drawings made her feel less alone, but the words were lost in sobs. At 4 years old, she still didn't fully understand why her aunt hated her so much, why each day brought new pain. "You're going to be locked in the room until I decide what to do with you," the aunt continued, pushing the child down the hall. "And if I hear so much as a peep, you'll experience a punishment you've never experienced before." The room where the girl was locked was small and stuffy, with only a high window that she couldn't reach. There, she curled up in the corner and began to hum her mother's lullaby softly, the melody being her only source of comfort in a world that seemed to have forgotten that she existed. It was this song that the retired teacher heard when she passed by the house on her way to the grocery store. She had spent the entire night thinking about the conversation with the girl in the yard, about the marks she had seen on the child's arms, about the atmosphere of fear that permeated that house. The teacher stopped in front of the gate and listened. The girl's voice was weak, but loaded with a sadness that broke the educator's heart. At that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going to the grocery store, the teacher went directly to City Hall, where the small Child Protective Services office was located. She knew the caseworker well, a former student of hers who had dedicated herself to the protection of vulnerable children. "I need to talk to you about a very serious situation," the teacher said, entering the office without ceremony. The caseworker looked up from the papers she was analyzing. "Teacher, it's good to see you. What brings you here today?" "A child in danger. My neighbor. I'm sure she's being abused." The caseworker straightened in her chair, her expression becoming immediately serious. During her 5 years in the position, she had learned to recognize when a report was serious, and the teacher wasn't the type of person who would make frivolous accusations. "Tell me everything," the caseworker said, picking up a complaint form. While the teacher reported her observations, across town, the lawyer was in a similar meeting at the district attorney's office. The prosecutor listened carefully as he presented the evidence collected by the businessman. "This is compelling evidence," the prosecutor said, examining the videos on the lawyer's cell phone. "I will order an immediate investigation and request the removal of the child from the family environment." "How long will that take?" the lawyer asked, concerned. "With this evidence, we can act today," the prosecutor replied. "I'll contact Child Protective Services now." It was thus that, by a coincidence that would change the girl's destiny, 2 simultaneous reports reached Child Protective Services on the same morning. The caseworker was finishing writing down the teacher's account when her phone rang. Child Protective Services. This is the district attorney. I need you to make an urgent intervention at a house on Main Street. We have evidence of serious child abuse. The caseworker paused, her pen suspended over the paper. Is it by any chance number 127, Yellow Victorian House? Exactly. How did you know? I just received a report about the same house, she replied, looking at the teacher with surprise. 2 independent sources. This confirms the seriousness of the situation. At 2 in the afternoon, a coordinated operation was being set up. The caseworker, accompanied by 2 social workers and a court officer, was heading to Main Street. The teacher had offered to accompany the team, using her experience with traumatized children. The businessman watched everything from his window, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after days of paralysis, he had managed to act. The lawyer was by his side, both witnessing the moment that would change the girl's life forever. "You did the right thing," the lawyer said, placing his hand on his friend's shoulder. "I hope it's not too late," the businessman replied, his eyes fixed on the team approaching the Victorian house. In the house, the aunt had left to buy alcohol at the corner bar, leaving the girl locked in the stuffy room. The child continued to sing softly, unaware that her life was about to change radically. When the caseworker knocked on the door of the Victorian house and received no response, she used her legal authority to enter the property. What they found inside surpassed even their worst expectations. A dirty and poorly maintained house, a strong smell of alcohol, and obvious signs of neglect in all the rooms. It was the teacher who first heard the weak voice coming from the room at the back. "There's someone here," she said, guiding the team down the hall. When they opened the door of the room and found the girl curled up in the corner, singing her sad song, everyone present felt a pang in their heart. The child raised her big, frightened eyes, not understanding who these people were or what they wanted from her. "Hi, honey," the caseworker said, crouching down to get to the child's level. "My name is Anna. We've come to help you." The girl looked at the teacher, recognizing the kind lady who had talked to her in the yard. A flicker of hope shone in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by fear. "Auntie will be mad," she whispered. "You don't have to worry about that now," the teacher said, reaching out her hand to the girl. "We're going to get you out of here, okay?" And so, after 8 months of silent suffering, the girl was finally removed from the house, where she had known only pain and fear. But as she was carried away in the teacher's gentle arms, she didn't know that her journey was just beginning, and that the businessman watching from the window held a secret that would change everything she thought she knew about her own story. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment on what you thought of my story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.